Welcome everyone to our fourth RelTalk of our series. The RelTalk webinar series is sponsored by Relevate, which is a research team dedicated to increasing public access to good scientific information about relationships. And the RelTalk series specifically is to highlight the unique voices of graduate students. Today, our presenter is Hanamori Skoblow, and she is a second-year doctoral student in human development and family science at the University of Missouri. After earning her bachelor's degree in psychology from Beloit College, she lived and taught in Spain and South Korea. Her research involves health and well-being in older adulthood, with a particular interest in the influence of culture and social relationships. So I will just remind everyone to keep their microphone muted and their video off so that Hana is the star of the show. And then if you have questions during the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat and we will have time at the end for questions.
All right, I'm going to start by sharing my screen. So first, I want to thank Paige for that introduction, and I want to thank Relevate for having me here today. I was looking at everybody here, and some of you I know, and some of you I don't, but we all have one thing in common. We are now, and always have been, getting older. We are now, and always have been, aging. That's part of living. And now that idea might make you feel uncomfortable. It might make you feel nervous. Maybe you feel excited or curious, or maybe you feel nothing at all. But the way you feel right now, your attitude toward aging, it matters. And it's what we're going to talk about today. We pick up attitudes towards aging way before society decides we're an older adult. Before 65, before retirement, before applying for Medicare or any other arbitrary start to older adulthood you want to apply. Children as young as 3 years old can parrot stereotypes about older adults. They learn these stereotypes from their environment, an environment that values youth and devalues age. They grow up and learn that it's rude to ask someone how old they are. They hear people speak to older folks like they're children. They watch TV that's full of young faces, or maybe there's an older character, but it's likely that they're portrayed as helpless and dependent, or grouchy and isolated. Now take a look at these ads and think about what our environment is teaching us about aging. I'll wait. So those children internalize these negative stereotypes about older folks, and eventually they become older adults themselves. So these stereotypes that were once about a different group are now relevant to them. They're relevant to us. This is why we call them self-perceptions of aging. We all perceive aging in a certain way. Eventually, if we live long enough, we see ourselves in that category too. Self-perceptions of aging is the official research term, but I prefer aging attitudes or attitudes towards aging because I think it's simpler. So that's what I'll be using here for the rest of the presentation. You might be wondering why this matters. It matters because attitudes are powerful. Our brains are powerful. How we conceptualize something affects more than that thing. When older adults hold negative attitudes towards aging, they're more likely to experience declines in functional ability and cognitive functioning. And when I say cognitive functioning, I mean both normative age-graded decline and pathological decline, like Alzheimer's and dementia. They're also more likely to experience cardiovascular disease. They're less likely to engage in preventative health behaviors like going to the doctor and being physically active. When health issues do arise, they're more likely to be hospitalized and more likely to stay in the hospital for longer. And if we think about the connection here, it makes sense. If we believe there's nothing left to look forward to, that the third act of life is destined to loneliness and ailment, why would I get an annual checkup? Why would I exercise if I don't really like it? What's the point? Why bother? So let's go back for a moment to this connection between negative attitudes towards aging and cardiovascular health. We think the link between these two is stress. It's stressful to feel like you're aging and you don't like that. It's stressful to be discriminated against for your age, and it's even more stressful to think that discrimination is based on something true. So feeling badly about aging and then encountering ageism in the real world, that results in higher blood pressure and heart rate and a greater likelihood of a cardiovascular event. Let's flip this the other way around. Negative attitudes towards aging are impactful, but positive ones are too. When older adults view aging positively, they experience less cognitive decline and dementia, even if they have a gene that's associated with dementia. They experience quicker recovery time. They live longer. I want to say this again because it's important. When older adults perceive aging positively, they live longer. Now, how much would you pay for a drug that gave you all these benefits? For a pill that might give you a healthier and longer life? Some people might pay a lot, but I'm giving it to you for free. Now, there's an experimental technique called priming, in which words or images are flashed in front of someone's face so quickly that they don't realize that they're taking it all in. But our brains are powerful, and they do. Research like this can flash age stereotypes of older adults at adults of all ages. So when older adults are exposed to these negative age stereotypes, they fulfill them, even when they didn't before. They start to walk more slowly. Their balance suddenly decreases. They perform worse on memory tests. They're more stressed. Their attitudes towards aging, combined with encountering ageist messages, is a self-fulfilling prophecy. These same patterns don't emerge for younger adults. People have to see themselves as the group being stereotyped in order for the stereotypes to be impactful. Now, I think this is an important topic all the time, but it's especially critical now. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen an increase in ageism and open ageism. Social media posts called COVID the boomer remover and boomer doomer, and referred to older adults as gray shufflers, moldy oldies, and coffin dodgers. Reports showed an increase in ageism around the world in countries affected by the pandemic, with predictable patterns of blaming, name calling, and scapegoating. Here in the US, even government officials targeted older adults, like when Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick said that grandparents might be willing to die for the greater good, which was, in his view, the US economy. Again, aging attitudes are formed by our environment and then triggered by encountering stereotypes. So in a moment like this, what kind of stereotypes are we encountering each day? And how does that impact not only today's older adults, but tomorrow's older adults? Now, this is RelTalks. And so far, I've been mostly talking about individual processes, internal beliefs. Where do other people come in? Our attitudes are so powerful that they influence not only us, but people around us, and vice versa. We're influenced by people in our social network. So in this image, each line represents a connection to another person we know. Imagine our attitudes being communicated and transmitted across each line from one person to another. I want to focus on intimate relationships for a moment because these are particularly influential. We spend a lot of time with our partners. We often live together. We spend our free time together. We have dates. We talk about our days. We talk about our thoughts and our attitudes. After retirement, couples spend even more time together. Older couples certainly break up and meet other people, but the majority of today's older adults have been in their relationships for a long time. They've had decades to become intertwined and interdependent. Older couples tend to have similar attitudes towards aging, and they influence how one another feels about aging. So let me illustrate with my own relationship. What I'm saying is that if my partner feels that aging is a drag, he's unsatisfied with aging, he can't see that anything has gotten better with time, then I'm likely to feel the same way. If his attitudes get more negative, mine probably will too. Now, this might be a bit of a downer, but the reverse of this phenomenon means that if I start to express more positive attitudes, he probably will too. So now I'd like to move into the more optimistic part of this talk. The good news is that we can improve our attitudes towards aging. They're modifiable. We can modify aging attitudes because our brains are plastic. This means that we can train ourselves into new ways of thinking. Every time we have a thought, our neurons forge connections. Thinking about an idea strengthens those connections. The more one thinks the same thought, the stronger these pathways become. If this idea is activated often, these neural connections will be at the front of our minds and prioritized over other options. So if we have a negative attitude toward aging, our neural pathways that connect a marker of age, like gray hairs or birthdays, to a bad reaction, this pathway becomes really strong. We have to be intentional. Instead of taking the automatic negative response, we opt for the positive reaction. We check ourselves. We say, is that reaction really true? Is that actually bad? Or is that internalized ageism? The more we work towards rerouting our thoughts to positive reactions, the stronger these other pathways become, and the more positive our attitudes towards aging become. There are three main ways that we can improve them. It happens to be just what we're doing here. First, we have to learn about age stereotypes and how self-stereotyping works. Then we have to understand myths and truths about aging. Then we need to create the environment free of ageism and ageist messages. So now that we understand age stereotyping, we'll move on to step 2. If we want to change attitudes towards aging in ourselves and in those around us, we need to have a better understanding of what aging and adulthood is actually like. So let's dispel some myths. Myth 1, older adults are sad. The truth is, older adults are happier than younger adults on average. Older adults experience fewer negative emotions, and when they do feel sad or angry, they're often better at coping. Myth 2, older adults are isolated. Here's the truth. Our social networks do get smaller with age, but this isn't necessarily a bad thing. We spend less time with acquaintances or friends of friends of friends. Instead, older adults tend to prioritize emotionally meaningful relationships with people who are important to them. Myth 3, older adults are discarded by their families. The truth is, the majority of older adults maintain loving relationships with their children throughout their lifetimes. Today's baby boomers are especially close with their children. And what's more, very few older adults actually live in nursing homes. In fact, only about 4.5% of older adults do. The overwhelming majority live in the community. Next myth, cognitive decline is inevitable. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not wearing rose-colored glasses. If we live long enough, many of us will experience some degree of memory loss. It might take us longer to process information, and it might become difficult to avoid distractions. But this is not all cognitive functioning is. Our memory for facts and information gets better with age. Our vocabulary continues to grow. We become experts in our interests. Last myth. There is only one experience of aging. When we talk about aging, context matters. There is substantial variation in the experiences of older adults, just like there is the experience of younger adults. Older adulthood is a 30-year span. So at different points in that span, our experience is going to vary greatly. Our experience is influenced by our genetic makeup, our lifestyle, our culture, our race, our gender, our religion, our community, our financial resources, and yes, our attitudes. Now remember that negative stereotypes results in worse outcomes. Well, the reverse is also true. Exposure to positive images of aging and older adults results in better performance, better memory, better balance, faster recovery. So we can create an environment that fosters a healthier view of aging. And I'm going to focus on a couple of ways we can do that. First, it's important that we're aware of the language we use because it affects us and those around us. When you speak with older adults, what's the tone? Is it childish? Is it babying? Or do you compliment people by saying they don't look or seem as old as they are? The implication being made is that there's something wrong with aging, when, as we've established, we're all doing it right now. The other point I want to make about aging, about language, is that to consider how you talk about your own aging. When it's getting close to your birthday, do you complain? When someone says you look nice, do you shoot that down by pointing out wrinkles? Do you say, I'm too old to wear that, to do that, to want that? Language influences attitudes, and attitudes matter. We can also consider the entertainment and media that we surround ourselves with. How many older authors are you reading? How many older characters are in the shows you consume? Are they full, multidimensional characters? Having characters who defy the stereotypes we see in our lives gives us a way to challenge negative aging attitudes in ourselves and in others. So to close, here are a few of my favorite recommendations for your ever-expanding list of media to watch and books to read. If you have other recommendations that fit this criteria, you can put them in the chat and we can all create the environment that we want to live in. I'll briefly explain these. So these first three in the top row, these are all nonfiction pieces. Ashton Applewhite's This Chair Rocks is like it says, a manifesto against ageism. So a lot of what she's going to be talking about is dispelling myths and truths about aging and creating the environment that we want to live in. Laura Carstensen's work is going to focus more on the socio-emotional aspects of older adulthood. And elderhood is from the perspective of a geriatrician. If you move down to the second row, we have Donald Hall's Essays After 80, who's poet laureate, but this is a collection of creative nonfiction essays about aging. And you have Grace Paley's posthumous book of collections, a wonderful poet. And although this is not intentionally a work about aging, certainly she was in late life when she wrote it, and a lot of pieces really are. And then we have Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan novels. You may have read them, they're quite famous. It's 4 works that follow a friendship between 2 women from childhood through older adulthood. So by the time you get to book 4, you're reading about the experiences of 2 women in late life. These are movies and TV shows. The first one, The Mole Agent, is a documentary that came out recently about an older man who goes undercover. The second is Morgan Freeman, Diane Keaton's romantic comedy about a couple living in New York City. Number 3, Grace and Frankie, is a popular Netflix show about 2 older women who are friends. And the last one, Up, is I think a really nice one because it's a good example of how we can give older protagonists to young children early, and we can start informing more positive images of older adults earlier in the life so that people can take these ideas with them as they progress through the lifespan themselves. here are some references. It might be a little overwhelming. If you are going to look into any of them, I recommend the one that's bolded here, Rebecca Levy's stereotype embodiment. This is the theory that a lot of this presentation is based on. And of course, if you want to discuss any of this further, clearly I love talking about it, so please feel free to email me. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Hannah. We are now going to open this up to questions. So if you have any questions, please put those in the chat.
Thank you for all the virtual clapping.
Tim says, thank you so much for a great presentation, Hannah. From your time abroad in Korea and Spain, can you share a bit about international perspectives on aging?
I think it's a really good question. I don't want to speak too much on this because I'm not as well versed in the research as I would really like to be, but I can tell you more anecdotally. So when I was teaching in Korea, one of the things that really struck me was the difference in attitudes that young children have towards older folks. And a good example here is I was teaching in primary school. So I taught little ones, I mean, 2nd grade through 6th grade. And every year, all those students would go on a field trip to an assisted living facility and they would give massages to the residents. And this was something that people really looked forward to and really valued, even so much that they had a very large portrait of one of the field trips commissioned and put on the wall to the entrance of the school. So it was one of the first things that you saw when you walked in, and it really establishes that this is something that we value, that this is something that's important, that we see as beneficial for our students and for the community. And that really struck me because it's something I found very difficult to imagine happening in my upbringing in the US.
While we're waiting for some more questions to come in, the question that I've been thinking since I have seen your presentation now a couple times is, what would you suggest for someone who in a moment notices like a really negative attitude about their own aging? Like, what's a way to work through that?
I think it's the same way that we would really check any of our implicit biases. I think that sometimes we think about them as different from other isms, as different from racism or sexism or homophobia, but it's still an idea that somebody has about a group of people. And so I think that the best way to do that is to first just start to recognize I'm having a negative thought about aging, whether it's my aging or it's somebody else's aging, and then to question that, to say, is this realistic? Is this not? And if it's not, then how can I reroute this? What is something that is in fact a more realistic representation of this experience I'm having or this situation that I'm in that I can change to?
Thank you.
It's a great question.
From Dwayne Rudy, any work on people being kind to their future selves?
Paige, what an excellent question that merges our interests together.
I know.
So for folks who were not at Paige's RelTalk, she works with self-compassion. And that's certainly what this question is getting at, is about being kind to ourselves here, as well as to our future selves and who we're going to become. So I think I would probably point people to the resource you pointed them to, which is Lisa Neff's self-compassion theory. And I think it was self-compassion.org. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think that's a great resource for establishing a self-compassion practice, whether you're thinking about your current self or your future self.
Yeah. And I love the idea that you brought up in your presentation that by battling stereotypes of aging now, I'm helping to create like a kinder future for my older self when I get there. A question from John Harvey. Thanks, Hannah, for your presentation and perspective. I'm fairly surprised at the ageism that has sprung forward with COVID. Do you think this is endemic in our culture, or is it more exacerbated by people seeing older populations as fragile?
I think that's an excellent question. I think that both of those are true. I think that we saw ageism start to increase around the Industrial Revolution when we had an economic divide between people who were working and people who were retired, and that's when we started to have some age segregation. And that's really when age became a much more important classification than it had been before. Right? We kind of previously had childhood and adulthood, and now we have these different groupings within that. So I think that there's a long-standing tradition of grouping people by their age, particularly in our culture as we delineate between employment and retirement. Not to say that everybody who's an older adult is retired, because that's certainly not the case, but it is a stand-in marker. That being said, I think that absolutely COVID is exacerbating a lot of ideas that people already had that maybe didn't feel as salient before, weren't worth voicing, but now that people feel like their freedom is being infringed upon, whether or not that's reality, then things are coming more out of the woodwork in a way that they may have just been more internalized before.
Another question, how would you suggest we reimagine and improve our younger attitudes toward aging with compassion and creativity?
That's such a lovely question. I know that one of the books that I recommended, Louise Aronson's Elderhood, speaks quite a bit about compassion and creativity and finding joy in the third act of life. But I think that what you're really getting at here is something very important, that it's important to start this early, right? It's never too late, of course, to adjust our attitudes, but like I was saying about how strong these neural pathways become with time, it's practice, right? It's 10,000 hours, okay? We become experts in being negative about our own aging. And so the sooner that we can try to reimagine that, the better for us. And I think part of that is having an option to reimagine it with, right? If all I'm seeing around me all the time is people who don't want to get older, who are really negative about that, then what choice do I have except to expect that that is how I should be performing aging as well? So it's a collective effort. Once one person starts to reimagine this, then, my optimistic view is that we can have a domino effect.
Okay, I think we got all the questions. So once again, thank you all for joining us tonight. Next week is our last RelTalk, and Christina Cordero will be presenting on supporting parents and supporting children, and it will be a great talk. So look out for that, as well as we will be sending a very short feedback survey to the same email that you registered for. So if you could fill that out, that helps us know how we can improve this project and help get some good information out there. And then again, thank you, Hannah, for presenting tonight.
Thank you, everybody. This was great.